over the years, me and the boys have built a lot of stuff using epoxy or resin or whatever you want to call it. We've done a bunch of river tables and I get asked a ton of questions about it all the time. So I'm bringing yins my 5 tips for building better river tables. Let's go. So cutting a slab in half can be kind of a pain. If you measure here, it's one distance, here's another, here's another. And if you mark the center, it starts to go all over the place. So the way we like to do it is taking a tape measure, this is a tape, and then get pretty close to the edge. I then like to use this trick where, like right now, this is, I don't know, 23 and we'll just say 5/8. But if I come down here, boop, to 24, I can then mark it at 12 inches there. Come down the other side and do the same thing. We're 24 and a half perfectly, so that's 12 and a quarter. Nice. So what I can do now is this is a chalk box, it's full of chalk, and then I'll pull it on those 2 lines. I usually grab a friend, that's Sam's friend hand, and then go ahead and snap the chalk line. What this does now is it gives me pretty much the center of the slab uniformly the whole way down. But that's not it. The next thing you want to make sure you're doing is using that line to give you square. We're going to cut this in half first to give ourselves a square edge. But you can use the same technique. If you were just trying to make a table out of this slab, you could line up off of your center line here and mark a line off of these to be perpendicular, and that would give you a perfectly square edge on both sides off the same reference point. So it's a good tip for getting the center of your slab and square edges. So the next tip is for estimating your resin. This is something I get a lot of questions on, like John, how do you actually go about knowing how much resin or epoxy you need in a river table like this? So here's how I like to do it. First, I get everything mocked up, or these are actually caulked in to my mold. Next, you're gonna wanna take your tape and measure your distance across. These can be rough estimates. So this, we've got 5 3/4, about 1 to 18 inches down. Here we're at 7, and just go down your slab, giving yourself a bunch of different measurements. So like this one's 5 7/8, just mark it at 6, because we're going to find the average of these. Now you're gonna bust out the ye old calculator. That's how much weight I lost this year. And then just do a little math. So to find the average is 6 plus the next number plus the next number plus the next number plus no, turn back. Plus, then we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 numbers. On average, the river is 6 1/4 inches wide. Awesome. So next thing we need to do is know the depth. We know these slabs are 1 5/8 and our overall river height is going to be 1.5 inches. So we like to give ourselves something to plane down after the fact. So the next thing I do is then go into, with those 2 numbers, I've got 6 1/4 and 1 5/8 inches thick, into a volume calculator. The volume calculator you'll see on calculator.net is one I use the most, and I use the rectangular tank calculator. We've got a length of 97 inches, just make sure you switch it over to inches. We've got that width of 6.25 inches, and then the height of 1.625. It gives us 985 cubic inches. So that doesn't actually help us, right? We don't buy anything in cubic inches. Well, this is why it's amazing what we can do on computers these days, because now I just go to a cubic inch to liter conversion, and it'll pop right up here on Google. We've got 985, right? Which will give us, boom, 16.14 liters. We then go and add about 10% more volume, or round it to the nearest number that's in thirds or fourths, depending on our epoxy. This one is 3 to 1. So because it's 3 to 1, 16 actually gives us a very easy number to use for liters. But we're using gallons on this one, so you can easily just hop in here. You gotta love that this is not sponsored. And use gallons, which is great. So we have 4.26 gallons, which will round up to 5, and therefore we can do one kit, full kit, that's 3 parts resin, 1 part hardener, and then we will be able to do another whole gallon to fill off the top. That's gonna be 75% resin, 1 part hardener, and we'll only need to measure in one of them. So I hope that helps when it comes to estimating. That should put us pretty close to getting to the top here. Like I said, we have a little bit of wiggle room, and you do have some imperfections there. If your river is laying down a lot more, like these are pretty vertical here, but if you get a lot of lay down on here, take your measurement from the top. It's better to have more than it is to have less, especially if you're adding pigment. When you add pigment, and then you need to make another batch, you're always gonna have a little bit of discoloration, then you're gonna go back in and mix it. So more is better in these situations. Before we get into the next tip, I wanna take a moment to thank this week's sponsor, ButcherBox. Trust me, you're gonna wanna watch this one. They've got a killer deal for you guys. We like a lot of things, two of them being cooking and eating, me especially. One thing we've noticed is that it's really hard to eat well or healthy when you're in the shop all day. We don't have the time to really go grocery shopping around here. My family doesn't really have the time because, well, we've got a 3-month-old and I run a business and so does my wife. ButcherBox has been an awesome addition for both parts of my life. If you're not familiar, ButcherBox is a delivery service that ships 100% grass-fed, grass-finished beef. You got free-range organic chicken as well, pork raised crate-free and simply humanely raised pork, and wild-caught seafood, all crated and shipped to your house. You can just pick 4 items on the website, which is super easy. They've got a ton of variety. It shows up at your house every single month, and it's only about $6 a meal, which if you think about it, for good quality stuff, is super reasonable. Myself and my family are loving ButcherBox. It greatly helps to make sure that we get good quality food and keep up with our extreme lifestyles and extreme squirreliness. I also know the guys love it when I treat them to delicious meats like this. Yes. Because you're so awesome, ButcherBox wants to give you guys free bacon for life. Yes! When you sign up now, they'll include bacon with every order you have, forever, until you cancel your subscription. Free bacon! So check out the link down in the description if you guys want to get free bacon for life and take advantage of this awesome service. And once again, appreciate you, ButcherBox, for sponsoring this video. Let's get on to that next tip. I know you guys are hungry for it, and I'm also hungry. Your next tip is surface prep and all the surfacing. River tables need surfaced. And I think you know that, you're aware of that. And there's multiple ways to do it, but one thing a lot of people overlook is pre-surfacing. So you can see here, we put these slabs on the CNC. And we didn't do that to try to save time on the back end. What we did was to try and give us a more uniform piece to put into our project. Therefore, it's not wonky and janky and all over the place. So go ahead and pre-surface your material before you put it in your table. A lot of people think you can just pour epoxy and then sand it and you're gonna be good to go. Highly suggest against. It's gonna be imperfect and you're not gonna like it. We've been in multiple situations where it just wasn't great. Someone gave it to us and we kind of had to fix their problem. So, flatten your epoxy table. I suggest getting your materials relatively flat before you put them in the mold, and then use something like Miss Piggy here as a CNC. We've got this piece of a bar top that we're working on for our client in here, and this does a phenomenal job of quickly making things flat. But you can do the same thing. If you've watched us in the past, you've probably seen us use this really cool woodpecker's jig that is made specifically for flattening. You can use this thing in a multitude of ways. River tables, just straight epoxy stuff, straight slab flattening, it's also phenomenal for. Really great tool, but it is a little bit pricey. If you want, you can go ahead and make your own jig, which I used to do in the past. I have a video on a 5-minute jig that I made out in California when I was working with Mike Montgomery of Modern Builds, and I've also made them out of 2x6s and just some scrap plywood. Anyway, it goes. Make sure you're flattening your project and you're doing it on a large solid surface. Don't just sand your epoxy table and then send it off. It's gonna be no bueno. The next tip is short and sweet. To oversize your boxes and molds. If you're wondering why, it's because we run into the situation all the time where we get a final dimension on a mold or a table size in which we're gonna make a river table, and then we make the mold to that size, and then we forget that the edges and stuff still need cleaned up, and it ends up being slightly under what we wanted it to be in the first place. So in order to avoid it, we always try to make our boxes slightly bigger. I'm talking like maybe a 1/2 inch on each side. What's cool is that melamine typically comes 1 inch by 1 inch oversized. So you're looking at, what's that, 97 by 49 instead of 96 by 48 if you go with a 4x8 sheet. We typically use melamine for our molds, and so it makes it easy to use those dimensions in order to kind of cut things in half, say if we're doing a 24-inch bar top or a 24-inch wide. Whatever we're doing. So there's your tip, oversized boxes. This tip is something I get a ridiculous amount of DMs, emails, snail mails. I sometimes get, what are those called? Smoke signals asking me about how do I get bubbles out of my resin. It's a lot easier than you think. First thing you're gonna wanna do is read the damn label. A lot of you guys are using the wrong epoxy in your river table applications. The specific brand of resin that you use will tell you how deep it can pour. That's literally it. So you don't want to try and pour resin that is made to be poured thick because it'll overheat, crack, and look awful. Also have a ton of bubbles and you'll get all kinds of issues. The same thing goes for resin that's supposed to be poured thick. If you pour it thin, then it doesn't harden, like ever, which is awful. So if you read the label, if it gives you a slow release time, the bubbles will typically remove themselves by, what is that, science?
Science rules.
Science. The air begins to heat up, it rises and comes out of your table. So that's the first thing I suggest to eliminate bubbles. Number 2 is going to be to control the temperature in your pour environment. When you get outside the parameters that are on the label or that are instructed to be used with your resin, it'll heat up too quickly. And then this will actually trap those bubbles I was just telling you about inside your resin and not allow them to release. If you leave it on the bottom end or the cooler end of the spectrum, typically 65 to 80 degrees in our experience, somewhere in that ballpark, if you keep it closer to that 65, it'll allow the resin to cure longer and let those bubbles come out themselves. Another tip is a heat gun. We use a MAP gas gun. It literally makes no difference. You can use MAP gas, propane. Some people even somehow use just actual heat guns. We don't know how that one works, but it works for some people. But propane, MAP gas, those would help with surface bubbles. And lastly, if you're pouring clear resin, I highly suggest using a pressure pot. When we did the guitar with all of the bullet casings in it, we did the first one without pressurizing or vacuuming, that's what it is, the air bubbles out of our resin, and we got a ton of just residual bubbles all throughout it, and we ended up having to do it again. Once we used the pressure pot, we were able to create a vacuum that pulls all of the air out and then pour the resin, and it worked out much better. We still had bubbles because we didn't put the bullets in before we did the resin. We're idiots, that's why we had bubbles. But we've had good success when you're trying to pour clear with using a pressure chamber, a pressure pot, the vacuum pot, whatever you want to call it. And we've got the one that we bought linked down in the description if you want to get one for yourself. So I hope this helps, and I hope you guys liked this video. If you want to see another 5 tips to building things with resin and epoxy, I've got this video queued up for you right here.